We're starting the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest recorded story that we have in all of humanity. The oldest version dates back to about 2000 BCE, though scholars like Herbert Mason points out that the story we have reads like a continued version of a much older story, perhaps even 1,000 years older. So the epic comes from ancient Mesopotamia, which you can see here on the map, including modern-day national borders. Different cultures in that region put their own spin on the story across different eras and translated it and revised it and so on. So what we have today is an amalgamation or collection of a lot of different versions, and it's not yet totally settled because new tablets have been discovered even into the 21st century. At any rate, the story is set in an ancient city-state of Uruk, which is in modern-day Iraq. And the central character is Gilgamesh, who was almost certainly the real king of Uruk about 2800 BCE. And there's more information on that in the Credence That Gilgamesh Existed video that you will also look at today. In the story, Gilgamesh is about 2/3 god and 1/3 human. So we can start by considering how and why an ancient king would be depicted in literature as a demigod. This provides us with an opportunity to get some insights into the beliefs and values of earlier eras and to see how some of those patterns can inform our understanding of the world today. Despite the incredibly long history, it seems to have been told and retold for 1,000 years. The story was lost to history as the empires of Mesopotamia fell. That is until about the mid-1800s when teams of archaeologists from, as Karen Kaiser believes, France and Belgium were digging in the rocks and unearthed a bunch of tablets, and then they continued with various teams to find new tablets here and there, including significant discoveries near modern-day Mosul. By the way, this is what a tablet looks like. They're only about 6 inches tall and like 5 or 6 inches wide. So if you're imagining like these huge blocks of stone, they're actually something you could hold in the palm of your hand. And the script on them, which is cuneiform, is quite small. Among these discoveries, the tablet pictured here is the one that caused particular excitement and discussion because of some parallels to biblical stories. For example, it has a description of a great flood that wiped out all of the inhabitants of Earth except for one man named Utnapishtim and his family. And John H. Marks, who writes the afterword in Mason's translation of Gilgamesh, explains that the story seems to have been revised and augmented from time to time until it probably received its final form toward the end of the second millennium, when the story of the Great Flood may have been incorporated. The Mason translation was first published by Mason, Herbert Mason, in the 1970s, and Mason focused his attention on the relationship between Gilgamesh and a character named Enkidu, who is taken from the wilderness and brought to society. Mason reminds us, though, in his afterword, that the Epic of Gilgamesh is historically about more than just that friendship. There's the relationship of gods to humanity, the sacredness of the walled citadel to be maintained by the key, the politics of the elders, the social structuring, the position of women, the kindredness of animal and man and all of nature to humanity, nature's animatedness and plenitude, justice and injustice, the cross-vitalization between city and steppe, the boundaries between the lawful and forbidden, the effects of all of these things on the two friends and course of history. The story reflects a broad spectrum of cultural beliefs and values and assumptions. In terms of content, the Epic of Gilgamesh is certainly epic. It's comparable to any modern film or TV show in terms of sex and violence and existential angst. And also, while this isn't so obvious in the Mason translation or the other big one, the N.K. Sanders translation, the story does have some gaps. Tablets are missing or broken, the linear thread isn't always clear, and some story elements were not entirely compatible, so scholars have shaped it into a cohesive story as best as they could. In really cool news, new lines were discovered as recently in 2015, so it is kind of a living document, and I hope when you delve into the story, you consider the tremendous journey that each line has taken to get to you. which is really cool. If this is your first time reading it, I'm happy to report that this story is much more readable than you may imagine. You're thinking, "Ooh, it's so old. How am I going to understand it?" It's very manageable. Some translations have a good bit of repetition, which fits with how the story developed in oral tradition, where the speaker would have memorized it, and as soon as you get into the rhythm of the storytelling, you should be fine. I recommend reading it in one sitting. It's only about 90 pages, and in my experience, the more breaks I take when I read this type of literature, the more time it takes to read it because you kind of have to re-enter that rhythm. In the analysis, there are many angles that we could take with the story. The most obvious is probably what it says about friendship and coming to terms with loss, and that's what Mason has emphasized. Since we're applying post-colonial theory, which is a 20th century approach to literary analysis, you might be wondering how or why we're combining that with something as old as the story of Gilgamesh. Even though the post-colonial theory was developed in the 20th century, that doesn't mean that it's only applicable to 20th or 21st century writings. We can still locate thematic connections and common patterns across eras. For instance, we got the idea that people draw the boundaries of their identities, like personal, societal, and national, by pointing out that people who think they aren't like them think of the Poco themes of identity and otherness, just as it's happening in the world around us. This is something that we can still recognize in our world's earliest writings. We can gain some insight into the causes and effects of these patterns. We can see how those in power justify and maintain their power. We can see the dynamics of oppression. And we can see how people establish and enforce the correct way to live. Correct way to live. Earlier, I quoted Mason's list of all the things that the story is about, and all of those power structures and cultural practices are ripe for analysis. If it helps to have some concrete questions as starting points, here are a few to consider. Who is othered? What's behind the decision to civilize Enkidu? And in what ways do Gilgamesh and Enkidu have a colonial relationship? Thanks for listening to this lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh. I really hope you enjoy reading this tale and the other videos regarding his history. And always, thank you, Karen Kaiser, for the information in this video.